Welcome back to ICC. We are back with another recap after the Olympiads rest day. It is round 7 and we're already seeing medal decising matches in both sections. In the open section, the top match was second seed India taking on third seed China, a clash people talked about even before the Olympiads started. We had hoped to get a preview of the World Championship match with Gukesh playing Ding Liren, but unfortunately that didn't happen. While India did indeed feature Gukesh on the top board, China decided to give world champion Ding Liren a rest day and went with a different lineup instead. Nonetheless, it all came down to the result of board 1 as Gukesh won the match after tricking Wei Yi in an equal endgame. In other important results of the day, Team Iran defeated the high-flying Team Vietnam with 2.5, 1.5. Last Olympiads champions Team Uzbekistan crushed Ukraine with 3-1. Team Serbia put an end to Netherlands' Olympiad dreams, winning 3-1, and Team Armenia scored a narrow win versus Team England. Let's see how it all happened. We are going to begin our overview of the open section with the game that defined the day, Gukesh versus Wei Yi. Here we have World Championship challenger Gukesh as he's trying to bring home the win for Team India as white. He has 2 knights in exchange for a rook, and in this position we have a bit of a race, as white is trying to promote the f-pawn while black is trying to advance his h-pawn. Here it was Wei Yi to move, and with only around a minute on the clock, he had to make a very tough decision. What was he supposed to do? Move h3, play rook f1, play rook d1 check. All of those have to rely on long and complicated calculations, ones he simply didn't have the time to perform. That's why he chose to go with his intuition and play the move h3. However, according to the engine, this is a losing mistake. In the position on the board, he had to go for the move rook to d1, trying to figure out which is the correct position for the rook. In the case of king e2, he has the unique resource of rook d5, indirectly preventing the move f7 from happening. The point is that, in the case of f7, black will play king e7, stopping the pawn from queening, and the white knight would still be under attack. Once it moves to f3, after king takes f7, knight takes h4, the position would be a draw. So another try for white in this position would be to go for king c4, guarding the d5 square. Then the line could have continued with h3, f7, rook c1, very important, king d3, king e7, stopping the pawn, and after knight g5, going for h2. So here, we're going to have a position on the board where both sides promote their pawns. After knight g6, king d7, f8 queen, h1 queen. Here, it's complicated to assess the situation. It's white to move, and it's not clear if you're calculating by yourself on the board whether there is a checkmate or not. Well, if there's a checkmate, that obviously decides the game, but does black have enough resources? Is his king safe? Turns out that yes, and the reason for that is the rook on c1. That's why the check was so important, because with the rook on a c-file, it takes some important squares from the knights as they start to jump. So let's say in the case of knight e5, king c7, queen e7, king b8, White doesn't have the resource to go knight c6 or something like that, and it turns out that the black king is completely safe. However, it's pretty tricky in a real game to determine that the rook is better placed on c1 rather than on d1 or on f1. So Wei Yi, in a sense, played the most human move in the position. He decided to advance his pawn. The problem is that White still has the resource of queening first and playing for checkmate. So the game went on with f7, rook f1, knight g5, preparing knight g6, h2, knight f3, blocking the way of the rook so that f8 promotes the pawn. And here we get the same dilemma. In the case of h1 queen, after f8 queen, this king would actually be mated. The rook is not on c1 anymore, and the combination of a queen and two knights against a naked king is simply devastating. So that's why in the game, king e7 followed, simply preventing f8 from queening. But after knight takes h2, black had his only and most important resource taken off the board. The game continued with rook a1, knight g4, rook a3 check, king d2, rook a4, and knight h6. Finally, there is no defense against knight g6 check and promoting the pawn. Wei Yi decided to give one or two checks, but here he finally saw it was no use and resigned the game. This match was very huge and really has the potential to decide the entire Olympiad. Gukesh once again rose to the occasion and played a brilliancy in the endgame. The chess power of this young man is so astonishing. Well, we will see how he does in the next rounds, and for now, we're going to pay attention to the next game of our recap. For our next game of the recap, we're going to take a look at a positional exchange sacrifice by none other than Magnus Carlsen. Here, he's playing black versus the young and talented player from Austria, Valentin Dragnev. The last move of the game has been bishop g3, hitting up the rook on e5. But did Magnus move the rook? Or did he see something better? Well, he did see something better as he went for the counterattack, the move c5, hitting the queen and the b4 pawn at once. White's problem is that in the case of b takes c5, after rook c5, everything on the c file would be hanging, and also the a5 pawn too. Which means that b takes c5 is not an option and White is forced to retreat the queen. He continued the game with queen d1, and Magnus offered an exchange sacrifice after picking up the pawn c takes b4. His idea is that after all the trades, in this position, the white pawns on a5 and c2 are rather weak. The white pieces are pretty passive with the rooks stuck to defending pawns, and black even has the bishop pair, the active pieces, and it is probably enough. Well, the engine agrees with Magnus, and the position is really enough for an advantage of the black pieces. So the game continued with knight d5. White is trying to at least gain a pass pawn after knight d5, e5. But unfortunately for him, this doesn't improve his situation by a lot. The game continued with e4, grabbing space and opening up the dark diagonal. bishop g4, f5, bishop h5, and rook c8. So here, what is white supposed to do? Should he protect the c2 pawn? I mean, he probably should, but in practice, it's not as easy to do so. Because if he tries to protect it with the rook from a1, let's say rook to c1, he would drop another pawn. He would drop the pawn on a5. And in the case of rook e2, he would run into some other trouble after queen e5, bishop d6, f4 coming. It also looks extremely unpleasant to play. That's why the player with white tried a more active approach. He played the move d6. The point of this move is that in case of, let's say, queen takes d6, queen takes d6, bishop d6, at the end of the line there is rook d1, hitting both bishops at the same time. That's why Magnus avoided taking the pawn, and instead he played the move queen to c5, simply maintaining the tension. The game went on with c3, an original try for white to include the queen, because in the case of b takes c3, which happened in the game, white is able to garner some counterplay after queen b3 check and queen takes b7. Well, it is still black who is fighting for the win, but maybe in the future white would be able to pick a pawn or like create trouble with his d6 and a5 pawns. The game went on with queen e6, queen takes a6, bishop takes d6, and here the player with white played the move queen to a7. The problem was that if he just kept things as they are, he would run into a discovered attack with bishop h2, which would pick up the queen. So in the game, we saw queen a7, c2, a6. Bishop f4, the idea behind this move is not extremely deep, it just supports the pawn. Queen b7, rook b8, queen a7. And here it turns out that the white queen on a7 has very limited scope of action. It doesn't have a square to go to, they're all taken away, and it's also blocking the root of the a pawn, which, well, you would want to avoid that ideally. So the game went on with queen d6, bishop e2, bishop e6. Black is simply improving his pieces because if the white pawn from a6 cannot advance, black is in full control of the situation because white has zero counterplay. So going next, we saw bishop f1, king h7, just in case, moving the king away. And in this position, white played the move rook to c1. This is clearly desperation, but even if he didn't decide to proactively give the exchange, bishop d2 would be coming on the next move with the threat of taking on e1 and playing rook b1. So, seeing all of this, he decided to do it himself. So he played rook to c1, takes, rook b1, and queen e3. White finally managed to get the queen out of the way and is threatening to advance the pawn with a7, a8. The problem is, this is all a bit too late. Black is simply faster. The game went on with queen to d1, absolutely breaking through white's defenses. So here, after a7, black simply took on c1 and white resigned the game. In the case of a8, it would be a matter of moves to finish the game after queen f1 and c1 queen. But even if white instead took on c1, after rook takes, a8. There is this important resource with rook f1 check, and again promoting the queen. Well done, Magnus. That was a fantastic victory, which also brought Team Norway another team win. So let's continue with our recap and the next games. It was another dramatic day in the women's section with huge matches as top seed India took on second seed Georgia on board 1. Throughout the match, the Indian women managed to remain fully concentrated and dictated the events on the boards. They scored a 3-1 victory, with youth triumphing over experience, with Vaishali and Vantika bringing it home on boards 2 and 4. This means the Indian women are still undefeated with perfect 7 out of 7 wins. Their competitors, though, aren't giving up either and are following close behind. Last Olympiad champions, Team Ukraine, tied their match with third seed Poland. The formidable Kazakhstan team got the better of Azerbaijan, and the dangerous Armenian team tied their match with another dark horse, Team USA, after the players with white pieces won each and every game in the match. In individual stories of the day, 16-year-old Eman Saman from Palestine moved to a 6 out of 6 results to fight for the individual gold on board 1. Let's wish her luck in competing with stars such as Kostenyuk and Kashlinskaya and see the best games of the day. The first game of the women's section I want to highlight is the game that actually saved Ukraine versus Team Poland. Let's see. Here, White has just played the move King to g5, securing the path in front of her pawn and counting on the fact that she would be faster. So here, international master Olivia Kiolbasa as Black had to make a choice. What does she do? Does she bring the knight back to stop the f-pawn? Does she push f5? Does she do something else? Out of all of those choices, she went for the move knight to d2, attacking the pawn and counting on the fact that after f4, she would have some pretty annoying checks, either from f3 or e4, which would allow her to bring the knight back. However, it turned out that knight d2 was actually a mistake. It was much more important for Black to advance the a-pawn. Still, that line is pretty hard to calculate over the board with only a couple minutes on the clock, and it's understandable why Olivia couldn't find a study-like solution. It's a beautiful, beautiful way to save the game, so let's take a quick look. So game could have continued with, not knight d2, a5, then f4, a4, f5 check, king d5, moving the king out of the way so there are no promotions with checks, f6, knight to d6. Black needs to do something about the f-pawn, otherwise white is faster. And here, in the case of f7, Black would simply take, and he would promote just in time to stop the h-pawn. That's why white needs to do something else, and knight f5 seems like a reasonable idea. The game could continue with knight f7 check, king g6, knight e5, king g7, a3, h6, a2, knight e3 check, king e6, and knight c2. So here it appears that after knight f7, h7, Black doesn't have a move, because if she moves the king away, then the knight will fall, and if she moves the knight, then h8 would be a queen. However, there's an important study-like resource which allows Black to save the game. She can play the move knight to h8, and here, in the case of king takes, which is honestly the only move that deserves attention. Black has the resource king to f7, stalemating the white king. Here, the only moves white would have would be moves with the knight, and in this position, white simply cannot win the game. There isn't a way to improve, and the king is stuck in front of the pawn forever. Well, that line is unfortunately pretty hard to find in a practical setting, so Olivia went for the move knight to d2, which is pretty rational, trying to attack the pawn. So the game ended quickly after f4, knight f3 check, king g6, and it turns out that here the knight is not very well placed. So we have a5, knight f5, keeping even the h4 square away, a4, h6, a3, h7, and here in the case of a2, h8 queen would defend the square, preventing the black pawn from queening. And in the case of what Olivia played, knight to e5, white is in time to take, and after a2, to bring the knight back, again preventing the pawn from queening. Well, Natalia Buksa managed to push through for her team and bring an important victory. So let's wish her good luck for the rest of the games and see the next game from the women's section. So for the final game of today's recap, I want to take a look at the critical Azerbaijan versus Kazakhstan match. Here is white. We have Alua Nurman, who is facing international master Gulnaz Mammadova. So at a first glance, it appears that the white king is in trouble, because after all, rook h1 mate is a very real threat. But it turns out that white has more than enough resources to counter this and even win the game. If you notice, in this position, everything is hanging. The black queen is hanging, the knight on d5 is hanging, the bishop on g5 is hanging. It is a complete mess. In such positions, it is usually easy to panic, but the young star from Kazakhstan managed to keep her calm and found the best move in the position. She played the move f3, opening up the way for the king. So now in case of rook h1, she can simply move her king up, with the queen still under attack, and black would lose a ton of material on the next move. That's why, to continue the game, Gulnaz chose the move bishop takes g5. This doesn't lose material, but it eases off the tension on the white king, and here black's position falls apart. The game continued with queen takes d5, queen takes d5, bishop d5, and in the endgame we're about to get, black is really struggling because she would be down a pawn and her pieces would suddenly be in all awkward places all over the board. So she tried to fight back with bishop takes h4. The game continued with bishop f7, making sure the bishop takes at least another pawn before it gives its life away. Bishop king takes f7, f takes g4, rook h6, g3, and in the aftermath, white has extremely strong pawns on d5 and c6, and it is inevitable that they will decide the game. Black is down 2 pawns with 0 counterplay. It is hard to imagine that anything at all will happen that will let her save the game. So let's jump a couple moves and see the next critical moment of the game. So here, black has just taken on the pawn on a3, and even though Gulnaz's position is losing, she's still fighting back. I mean, The C and D pawns haven't crashed through yet, so not always lost. Seeing all of this and how important of a blockader the bishop from a3 is, Alua sacrifices an exchange with rook takes to a3. After that, she was free to advance her pawn because in the case of c takes d6, c7, rook c8, knight d6 comes with a check and picks up the rook, regaining material. So that's why Gilnar played the move rook to a6, king d5, supporting the pawns all the way, h6 or something else, doesn't really matter, d7, rook a5, and we can tell that those pawns are too big of a force to fight with, and Black's position was simply totally lost. And this nonetheless allowed for a picturesque final position, as Alua sacrificed the knight as well, counting on the fact that the two pawns would promote to a queen. So here, in this position, she finally advanced the d pawn to d8, and her opponent resigned. Well, this was an exciting game by the young Kazakh star. She really has a bright future ahead of her. I believe she has also scored international master norms. So we will be excited to see more of her games and how her team does. That was all for today's recap. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.